On April 1st, 2006, Brian Shaffer walked into a crowded bar in Columbus, Ohio. He was surrounded by people, surrounded by cameras. Security footage shows Brian entering through the only public entrance. Every person who went inside that night was later recorded leaving through the same door. Everyone except Brian Shaffer. He was never seen leaving. He was never seen again. How does someone disappear in public? The disappearance of Brian Shaffer is often described as a real-life locked room mystery, a case that defies logic and probability. On the night of March 31st, 2006, extending into the early hours of April 1st, a 27-year-old medical student entered the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a bar on the second floor of a building in Columbus, Ohio, near the Ohio State University campus. Multiple security cameras recorded his arrival. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing him inside. But when the bar closed at 2 in the morning and the crowd dispersed, Brian Shaffer was gone. No camera captured him leaving. No witness remembers seeing him exit. And despite extensive searches and an investigation that continues nearly 2 decades later, no trace of him has ever been found. This case stands apart not because of when it happened, but because of where it happened. In a crowded public space, under constant surveillance, a man disappeared completely. Brian Randall Shaffer was 27 years old in the spring of 2006, a second-year medical student at Ohio State University with a future that appeared carefully planned and well within reach. Those who knew him described someone intelligent and focused, driven without arrogance, a young man accustomed to the pressure of medical school and capable of carrying it. Brian was especially close to his father, Randy, who had raised him largely on his own after divorcing Brian's mother years earlier. Their relationship was steady and dependable, built on routine conversations and shared time whenever Brian's demanding schedule allowed. It was the kind of bond formed through shared responsibility and mutual respect. Just 3 weeks before Brian vanished, his mother, Renee, died after a long battle with cancer. The loss weighed heavily on him. Friends noticed that he had grown quieter, more introspective, absorbing his grief privately rather than outwardly. But even in mourning, Brian did not withdraw from his life or his plans. At the same time, his future seemed increasingly defined. He was in a serious relationship with Alexis Wagoner, a fellow medical student who understood both his ambitions and the sacrifices they required. The two spoke openly about marriage and life after graduation. Brian was not drifting, he was moving forward deliberately. On March 31st, 2006, Ohio State's spring break was about to begin. Brian and Alexis were preparing to travel to Miami together, a trip meant to provide relief from academic pressure and recent loss. Before leaving town, Brian wanted one night out with friends, a brief return to normalcy before the trip. It was an unremarkable decision, and it was the last ordinary choice he would ever make. The evening begins with dinner. At 6 o'clock on March 31st, Brian meets his father, Randy, the two sharing a routine meal and conversation. Randy later recalls that Brian seemed tired, but in good spirits. They talked about school, about Brian's upcoming trip to Miami, about ordinary things. Nothing felt urgent, nothing felt final. They said goodbye with plans to talk after Brian returned from vacation, a farewell that would later take on unbearable weight. After dinner, Brian returned to his apartment to get ready for the night. Around 9 o'clock, he met his close friend Clint Florence at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a bar located on the second floor of a building near the Ohio State campus. The bar had only one public entrance and exit, accessible by an escalator from street level, an architectural detail that would later become central to the mystery. They were joined by Meredith Reed, a friend of Clint's. Security cameras captured Brian entering the bar and moving through the crowd. The footage shows nothing unusual. Brian socializing, talking with friends, blending easily into a packed Friday night scene at the start of spring break. At 9:56 p.m., Brian stepped aside to call his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner. The conversation was brief and affectionate. Brian told her he missed her, that he would see her soon, that he was looking forward to their trip. Alexis later said he sounded happy and relaxed, slightly intoxicated but not distressed. It was a normal call, and the last time she would ever hear his voice. As the night moved toward closing time, Brian continued circulating through the bar. Witnesses recalled seeing him at different points throughout the evening. At 1:55 a.m., security cameras captured the final confirmed image of Brian Shaffer. He is seen near the entrance, speaking briefly with two women who appear to be entering the bar. He gestures back toward the interior, turns and walks away from the camera, back into the crowd. No camera ever records him leaving. At 2 a.m., the bar closed. Clint and Meredith exited with the rest of the crowd and waited outside, expecting Brian to follow. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Brian did not appear. At first, there was no panic. Perhaps Brian had left with someone else. Perhaps he slipped away unnoticed. It was inconvenient, but not alarming. Eventually, Clint and Meredith gave up waiting and left, assuming they would hear from Brian in the morning. They never did. Brian Shaffer was never seen again. When Brian Shaffer fails to return home or make contact with friends and family on April 1st, concern builds gradually throughout the day. By evening, when he misses planned commitments and remains unreachable by phone, that concern turns into genuine alarm. Alexis contacts Brian's father, Randy, who begins calling hospitals and reaching out to Brian's friends, trying to understand where his son might be and why he is not responding. By April 2nd, with no sign of Brian and no reasonable explanation, Randy Shaffer contacts the Columbus Police Department to file a missing persons report. The police response is immediate. Brian's disappearance does not resemble the typical pattern of young adults who go missing after a night of drinking. He is not known to vanish for days at a time. He is a disciplined medical student with strong family ties, an active academic life, and a serious relationship. Detectives quickly recognize that his sudden absence from all routine behavior is deeply abnormal. Investigators begin by interviewing those who were with Brian on the night of March 31st, starting with Clint Florence and Meredith Reed. Both provide detailed and consistent accounts of the evening, the bars they visited, Brian's demeanor, his level of intoxication, and the plan to leave together when the Ugly Tuna Saloon closed. Neither recalls anything unusual or troubling about Brian's behavior. Both express confusion over how he could have disappeared without them seeing him leave. Attention then turns to the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Detectives obtain and review hours of video, documenting every person entering and exiting through the only public entrance. The result is deeply unsettling. Brian is clearly seen entering the bar. He is seen inside throughout the night, but there is no footage of him leaving. No missed frame, no obscured angle, no moment where he slips past unnoticed. With no evidence that Brian exited through the monitored entrance, investigators explore alternative possibilities. Bar staff are questioned about service corridors, emergency exits, or any routes that might bypass the cameras. No such path offers a clear explanation. Some staff remember seeing Brian inside that night, but no one recalls seeing him leave. The focus then shifts to the building itself. If Brian did not leave, investigators reason, then he must still be inside. The bar, surrounding areas, construction zones, basement spaces, and rooftop access points are searched extensively. Cadaver dogs are brought in to detect any sign of human remains. The searches yield nothing. No scent, no evidence, no indication that Brian died or was concealed within the building. Investigators also examined Brian's cell phone activity. In 2006, phones regularly connected to nearby towers, allowing movement to be tracked in broad terms. Brian's phone stops registering with cell towers shortly after 2 in the morning, around the time the bar closed. It never reconnects. No calls are made, no messages are sent. The device vanishes from the network as completely as Brian himself. One detail of the investigation attracts public attention. Clint Florence is asked to take a polygraph examination. He declines. While refusing a polygraph is a legal right and not uncommon, the decision fuels speculation. Clint maintains that he cooperated fully in every other aspect of the investigation, and law enforcement ultimately clears him of suspicion, finding no evidence linking him to Brian's disappearance. Still, the refusal remains one of many unresolved details that continues to divide public opinion. As days turn into weeks with no sign of Brian, the investigation expands beyond the bar and its surroundings. Parks, waterways, abandoned structures, and remote areas are searched. His bank accounts show no activity. His credit cards remain unused. He makes no contact with friends, family, or his medical school. For someone to vanish this completely would require extraordinary planning or an equally extraordinary crime. Neither explanation fits comfortably with the known facts. From the very beginning, the investigation faces a paradox it cannot escape. Brian Shaffer appears to have vanished not in isolation or darkness, but in a crowded public space, under constant surveillance, leaving behind no physical trace and no clear path out. The absence of clear evidence about what happened to Brian Shaffer has allowed multiple theories to emerge over the years, each attempting to explain a disappearance that defies ordinary logic. Investigators, family members, and the public have proposed explanations ranging from conventional crime to deliberate disappearance, but none has been conclusively supported by evidence. The most straightforward theory suggests that Brian left the Ugly Tuna Saloon through an exit not covered by security cameras and later met with foul play. While the main entrance was monitored, the building contained construction areas and service corridors that may not have been under surveillance. Brian, possibly intoxicated, could have entered one of these areas intentionally or by mistake and exited the building unseen. Once outside, he may have encountered someone with criminal intent and been robbed or assaulted. This theory requires no elaborate conspiracy and aligns with known patterns of opportunistic crime. A young man alone in the early morning hours could be vulnerable. However, its major weakness is the complete absence of evidence. No witnesses reported seeing Brian outside the bar. No personal items were recovered. No tips or physical traces ever surfaced. For this scenario to be correct, every step would have had to occur without leaving a single verifiable trace. A darker variation proposes that something happened to Brian inside the bar itself. According to this theory, Brian may have died or been seriously injured within the building, possibly due to an accident in a restricted area or a violent altercation. His body would then have been removed through a non-public exit, explaining why cameras never captured him leaving. This explanation requires a coordinated cover-up involving multiple people who would have had to conceal death and remain silent for years. Investigators examined this possibility carefully, interviewing staff, searching the premises, and looking for forensic evidence. They found no signs of violence, no blood, and no inconsistencies in staff accounts. While it cannot be completely ruled out, there is no evidence to support it. Another theory suggests that Brian disappeared voluntarily. Supporters point to the stressors in his life, the recent death of his mother, the pressures of medical school, and the expectations of a serious relationship. The idea proposes that Brian planned his disappearance, left the bar unseen, and began a new life under a different identity. This theory struggles against substantial contradictions. Brian left behind his identification, money, bank accounts, and credit cards. He has never accessed his finances or contacted anyone he knew. Starting over without resources is extraordinarily difficult. More importantly, Brian was deeply connected to his father, his friends, and his girlfriend. Voluntarily subjecting them to permanent uncertainty and grief does not align with how he was described by those closest to him. Brian's father, Randy, dedicated the rest of his life to searching for his son. He hired private investigators, appeared in the media, and maintained a public presence in hopes of finding answers. The voluntary disappearance theory requires believing that Brian remained hidden despite knowing the suffering his absence caused, a psychological burden difficult to reconcile. One additional theory that gained attention involves the so-called smiley face killer hypothesis, which proposed that young men in the Midwest were being targeted and drowned by an organized group. The FBI investigated this idea and found no evidence supporting the existence of such a network. In Brian's case, searches of nearby waterways produced nothing, and no evidence connects his disappearance to serial killer activity. In the end, none of the theories fully explain what happened to Brian Shaffer. Each possibility requires assumptions that conflict with known facts or rely on circumstances leaving no trace behind. Brian vanished in a crowded public place, under surveillance, and left no physical evidence, no financial trail, and no definitive explanation. The truth remains unknown, suspended between competing theories, each plausible in isolation, but incomplete on its own. The investigation into Brian Shaffer's disappearance was never officially closed, but over time it inevitably lost momentum. Not because investigators stopped caring, and not because they gave up, but because the case ran into a problem that no amount of effort could overcome: the absence of evidence. Without a body, investigators lack the foundation that drives most homicide cases forward. A body provides cause of death, time of death, and often forensic links to a perpetrator. It confirms that a crime has occurred and allows law enforcement to escalate a missing persons case into a murder investigation with expanded resources and legal authority. In Brian's case, none of that was possible. Investigators suspected foul play, but suspicion alone is not enough to build a case. Time only made the situation worse. As years passed, memories faded, witnesses moved away or died. Any physical evidence that might once have existed degraded or was lost. Detectives who worked the case early on retired or transferred, and new investigators were left to piece together thousands of pages of reports without the benefit of first-hand familiarity. Cold cases do not freeze in place, they erode. Technology also offered little relief. Brian's phone stopped communicating with cell towers shortly after the bar closed and never reconnected, eliminating the possibility of later digital tracking. Security camera technology improved dramatically in the years that followed, but investigators were confined to the limitations of 2006-era footage. There were no additional angles to review, no higher resolution images to recover. What existed then is all that exists now. The nature of Brian's disappearance created another obstacle. The fact that he vanished from a confined, monitored space turned the case into a real-life locked-room mystery. It attracted intense public interest and endless speculation. Online forums and true crime communities analyzed every frame of footage and every known detail. Occasionally, this attention generated tips worth examining. More often, it produced noise, theories disconnected from evidence and impossible to investigate in practical terms. The case lost its strongest advocate in September of 2008 when Randy Shaffer died in a tragic accident after being struck by a falling tree limb while on vacation. Randy had been relentless. He hired private investigators, maintained public awareness campaigns, and pushed law enforcement to keep searching for answers. His death removed the person most determined to keep Brian's disappearance from fading into obscurity. Today, the case remains open but unresolved. There is no new evidence to pursue, no physical trail to follow, and no definitive proof that a crime even occurred. Brian Shaffer did not simply disappear because investigators failed. He disappeared because whatever happened to him left almost nothing behind. The investigation into Brian Shaffer's disappearance was never officially closed, but over time it inevitably lost momentum. Not because investigators stopped caring, and not because they ran out of theories, but because they ran into something far more limiting: the absence of evidence. Without a body, law enforcement lacked the foundation that drives most homicide investigations forward. A body establishes cause of death, time of death, and often provides forensic links to a suspect. It confirms that a crime occurred. In Brian's case, none of that existed. Investigators could suspect foul play, but suspicion alone is not enough to build a case. As the years passed, the situation only worsened. Memories faded, witnesses moved away, potential evidence degraded or disappeared entirely. Detectives who worked the case early on retired, leaving behind reports but not the instincts or first-hand impressions that often guide breakthroughs. Cold cases do not remain frozen in time, they slowly erode. Technology offered little help. Brian's phone stopped connecting to cell towers shortly after the bar closed and never reactivated. Surveillance footage remained limited to the angles and resolution available in 2006. There were no new cameras to review, no hidden footage waiting to be discovered. What investigators had then is all they have now. The circumstances of Brian's disappearance turned the case into a real-life locked-room mystery. That fact drew intense public attention and endless speculation. Online communities dissected every frame of video and every known detail. Occasionally, tips emerged that warranted review. More often, the noise obscured the facts rather than clarified them. The case also lost its strongest advocate in September of 2008, when Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, died in a tragic accident. Randy had been relentless. He hired private investigators, pushed law enforcement, and refused to let his son's disappearance be forgotten. With his death, the pressure to keep searching quietly diminished. Today, the case remains open but unresolved. There is no new evidence to pursue, no physical trail to follow, and no definitive proof that a crime even occurred. Brian Shaffer did not simply disappear because investigators failed. He disappeared because whatever happened to him left almost nothing behind. Cases like this one remind us how fragile the line between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy can be. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the Unsolved Echoes. Some stories never truly end. Thank you for watching.